There is a force that holds everything you have ever known together. You do not see it. You do not feel it directly. But without it, nothing in your world would remain stable for even a moment. There is a force that shapes everything you have ever experienced, and yet you have never once seen it. Not because it is hidden, but because without it, nothing you recognize could remain stable long enough to be recognized at all. We usually give it a name, gravity. But that word is too small for what it actually does. Gravity is not simply a pull, it is a structure, a silent rule that organizes space, motion, and time into something coherent enough for existence to continue without collapsing into randomness. Everything you have ever observed is participating in it. Every step your body takes is continuously corrected by it. Even your sense of up and down is not a perception you created. It is a consequence of a rule that has never once failed within your experience. And because it never fails, it disappears from awareness. Not because it is insignificant, but because it is perfectly consistent. Now imagine something almost impossible to notice. Not destruction, not chaos, not an explosion of change, just a single second where this rule stops expressing itself. Not weakened, not distorted, simply absent for 1 second. At first, nothing would appear to change, because reality does not stop when its structure is interrupted. It continues from the last valid state it remembers. A person mid-step would not fall or float. They would continue moving exactly as they had committed to moving, not because gravity is still active, but because motion does not require permission to continue once it has begun. Air, which normally organizes itself in invisible vertical layers of pressure, would continue moving as well, but without its usual hierarchy. Warm air would not rise, cold air would not sink. For that brief moment, the atmosphere would lose its direction, not into chaos, but into a kind of temporary equality of motion. Water behaves differently, not violently, not dramatically, but structurally. A glass of water would not spill in any meaningful sense during that second, because spilling requires direction, and direction requires structure. Instead, liquid would momentarily lose the idea of a stable surface. Its boundaries would become undefined in how they hold form. And then, almost immediately, everything returns. Gravity comes back. Not gradually, not carefully, but completely. As if nothing had ever paused it at all. And this is where the real complexity begins. Because everything that continued moving during that missing second is now re-entering a system that assumes continuity was never broken. So the system does not restart, it corrects. And correction is never perfectly synchronized. Different parts of the atmosphere re-establish balance at slightly different speeds. Some regions stabilize almost instantly. Others lag behind by fractions of time, too small to notice individually, but large enough to matter when everything is connected. This creates a subtle mismatch. Not an event, but a distributed inconsistency that the system must quietly absorb. The oceans respond more slowly, because water carries motion through depth. What happens at the surface is never isolated from what happens below. So when gravity returns, each layer realigns on its own timing. Surface motion first, deeper currents later. Between them, a temporary mismatch appears in how energy is distributed. Not enough to be visible, but enough to slightly alter long-term flow. And because oceans regulate the planet's climate, even the smallest change in timing matters across larger scales. On land, nothing breaks, but everything resettles. Every structure exists in constant dialogue with downward force. During that 1 second, that dialogue pauses. When it resumes, it does not resume identically. It resumes slightly differently. Not in a way that can be directly measured, but in a way that becomes part of long-term structural balance. Even life responds quietly. The body does not perceive gravity as a thought. It is embedded in prediction. So when that prediction is interrupted and restored, there is a subtle recalibration in how motion feels. Not noticeable as an event, more like a brief reduction in certainty. And then it disappears. Because the brain does not store single, non-repeating anomalies as meaningful memory. It absorbs them into continuity. What remains is not disruption, it is adjustment. A system that has quietly adapted to something it never consciously registered. And because everything returns to function, nothing appears changed. But systems do not require visible change to be affected. They only require exposure. And exposure has already happened. Once, everywhere, at the same moment. And from here, reality continues as if nothing unusual ever occurred. Not because nothing happened, but because everything that happened has already been absorbed into the structure that follows it. And that structure continues to behave normally, which in systems like this is the most important sign that something has changed, without ever needing to announce itself.
When a system absorbs a disturbance without breaking, it does something subtle. It does not erase the disturbance. It distributes it. Across motion, across time, across every interacting layer that makes stability possible. So what follows the brief absence of gravity is not a visible correction event. It is a quiet redistribution of equilibrium. At the level of air, this redistribution is almost invisible. But air is not simple. It is a constantly moving balance between temperature, pressure, and density. And those relationships depend on continuous reference to a downward force. When that reference briefly disappears and then returns, the atmosphere does not remember it as a memory. It adapts to it as a new continuity state. Pressure systems begin to realign, but not at once. Some regions settle into their previous structure quickly. Others take slightly longer, allowing micro differences in airflow that did not exist before. These differences are not large enough to be called changes in weather, but they are large enough over time to slightly adjust how energy is transported through the sky. Cloud formation, which depends on very delicate balances of rising air and cooling expansion, continues as usual. But the thresholds at which condensation occurs are now operating within a system that has been fractionally rebalanced. Nothing visible shifts immediately, but the conditions under which patterns repeat are no longer identical. The oceans respond in a deeper way, not because they are more important, but because they are slower to settle. Water carries inertia across depth. When gravity briefly disappears, even for a second, that inertia is not interrupted. It continues. But when gravity returns, the vertical alignment of that motion must be reconstructed. This happens in layers. Surface water adjusts first, responding quickly to restored downward force. Mid-level currents adjust next, shifting their flow path slightly as equilibrium is reestablished. Deep ocean movement follows much later, slowly aligning itself with the corrected structure above it. This layered response creates a subtle internal delay in how energy moves through the planet's largest system of heat storage. Not a disruption you could observe directly, but a quiet difference in timing. And timing in a system this large is a form of structure. On land, the effect is even more distributed. Every physical structure is constantly balancing internal stress against external force. During the missing second, those stress patterns are momentarily unanchored. When gravity returns, each structure reestablishes equilibrium independently, not as a unified response, but as millions of local adjustments happening at the same time. A building does not shift visibly, but the internal distribution of load settles into a slightly altered configuration. A mountain does not move, but the microscopic balance of pressure within its structure resumes along a path that is not perfectly identical to the one before. These differences are far below the threshold of perception, but they exist within the system. And once a system contains differences, even extremely small ones, it no longer remains perfectly identical to its previous state. Life, meanwhile, continues without awareness of any of this. Biological systems do not track gravity as a concept, they internalize it as expectation. So when expectation is briefly interrupted and then restored, the result is not recognition, it is recalibration. Movement feels unchanged, but predictive confidence in movement is slightly adjusted. The body continues functioning exactly as before, but with a microscopic shift in how it anticipates stability. This is not something that can be isolated as a feeling. It is too small, too distributed, too embedded in continuous processing. So it disappears into normal experience almost immediately. Human perception, which depends on stable physical prediction, briefly registers something that cannot be clearly identified. Not an error, not a sensation, just a moment where physical certainty feels fractionally less absolute than usual, and then it fades. Because perception does not hold on to single, non-repeating inconsistencies, it filters them out to preserve continuity. And continuity is what the mind uses to define reality. So what remains is a world that feels unchanged, even though every layer of that world has been exposed, even for a moment, to a condition it was never designed to sustain, and now continues forward in a slightly adjusted form that does not announce itself as adjustment, only as normality. Which is how most large systems evolve when no single observer can see the full shape of what has changed.
When systems adjust without breaking, they do not announce the point of change. They simply continue in a slightly modified state, as if that state had always been the reference point. After the brief interruption in gravity and the layered correction that followed, the most important shift is no longer located in any single physical system. It is located in how systems relate to each other. Because nothing exists in isolation, atmosphere, oceans, land, and life are all continuously exchanging energy, motion, and structure. So even the smallest disturbance does not remain confined. It spreads through relationships, slowly, quietly, without requiring visibility. In the atmosphere, the earlier micro-adjustments in pressure alignment do not remain local. Air is always moving toward balance, which means any small asymmetry becomes part of a larger redistribution process. This does not create instability, it refines patterns. Wind systems continue to circulate, but the timing of their alignment with temperature gradients is now slightly different than before. Not enough to produce a new weather identity, but enough to subtly alter repetition over long cycles. Storm formation still follows the same principles. Warm air rises, moisture condenses, energy is released, but the thresholds at which these processes stabilize or dissipate are now operating within a system that has been fractionally rebalanced. So outcomes remain familiar, but their timing is not identical. The oceans continue to act as the planet's slowest regulator of energy, and because they are slow, they carry the deepest traces of structural adjustment. After the brief absence of gravity, vertical layering in ocean movement does not perfectly return to its previous configuration. It returns to a corrected version of it. Surface water, mid-depth currents, and deep circulation continue their movement, but the boundaries between these layers are now slightly redefined. This does not produce visible ocean change. It produces a subtle shift in how energy is distributed over long periods. Heat retention in certain regions becomes fractionally more efficient. In others, release becomes slightly delayed. These differences are not dramatic, but they are persistent. And persistence across planetary systems is what defines long-term structure. On land, the redistribution continues in an even more distributed form. Soil systems, atmospheric interaction with terrain, and surface temperature cycles all continue as before, but the timing of their interaction with atmospheric movement is now operating under a slightly adjusted equilibrium. Snow formation in colder regions still occurs, but the balance between accumulation and melt is now fractionally different. Rainfall patterns still follow seasonal cycles, but the precise boundaries of those cycles are no longer perfectly aligned with historical averages. Nothing has shifted enough to be noticed as disruption, but everything has shifted enough to no longer be identical.
Life continues to adapt without awareness of the original interruption. Biological systems are built not to preserve history, but to maintain function. So when environmental inputs change slightly, even at levels too small to consciously detect, the response is not interpretation, it is adjustment. Behavioral patterns remain stable, but their internal weighting shifts. Migration timing, feeding cycles, and reproductive synchronization all continue with subtle variations that accumulate over generations. Human systems operate within this same structure. Agriculture, settlement, and resource distribution continue to function as though the environment is stable, because stability is what the system requires to operate. But the definition of stable is not fixed, it is statistical. And when underlying distributions shift, even slightly, stability adapts without requiring awareness of the shift itself. Over time, what was once a deviation becomes baseline, and what was once baseline becomes historical reference only. The most important aspect of this entire process is not that anything dramatic occurs. It is that nothing needs to appear dramatic for the system to change.
because large-scale systems do not transform through events. They transform through accumulation, and accumulation does not announce itself. It simply continues until the result is no longer distinguishable from origin. At this stage, the interruption that once defined the entire scenario is no longer treated as a meaningful anomaly within any system, not because it was erased, but because it has already been fully integrated into the structure that follows it. And once integration is complete, there is no longer a separation between what was and what is, only a continuous present that behaves as if it has always been this way.
When a system has absorbed a disturbance long enough, it stops referencing it as something separate from itself. It does not forget in the way human memory forgets. It reorganizes so completely that the distinction becomes unnecessary. After the initial interruption in gravity and the cascading adjustments across atmosphere, oceans, land, and biological systems, what remains is no longer a response. It is the stabilized outcome of that response. At the planetary scale, this means something subtle but fundamental. All major systems continue functioning, but their relationships have settled into a slightly redefined equilibrium. Atmospheric circulation still redistributes heat across the planet, but the timing of pressure balance formation is no longer identical to its previous long-term pattern. Wind systems still form predictable global structures, but those structures are now expressed through a slightly shifted rhythm of interaction between temperature zones. Nothing is unstable, but nothing is identical either. The oceans, which act as the deepest memory layer of planetary energy, now carry this adjustment most clearly. Not in a visible way, but in the timing of internal heat movement. Surface waters, mid-depth circulation, and deep ocean flow continue to exchange energy, but the synchronization between these layers is no longer perfectly aligned with the historical baseline. This does not produce disruption, it produces a new consistency, one that slowly replaces the previous one through continuous motion. On land, long-term geological and surface systems reflect the same quiet reconfiguration. Erosion patterns, sediment movement, and thermal expansion cycles continue as they always have. But the fine balance between external force and internal resistance has been fractionally adjusted. This does not reshape landscapes in a noticeable way. It subtly changes the rate at which they evolve over long spans of time. Life continues within this system without interruption. Biological processes are not designed to track absolute physical constants. They are designed to maintain function within the range of conditions they experience. So when those conditions shift slightly, adaptation does not appear as response. It appears as continuity. Populations do not recognize that their environmental baseline has changed. They simply continue operating within the updated range of stability. Over generations, this leads to gradual redefinition of ecological relationships, not as sudden shifts, but as slow adjustments in timing, distribution, and interaction. What once was seasonal becomes slightly offset. What once was synchronized becomes loosely phased. But everything remains within the bounds of viability, which is what matters most to biological systems.
Human civilization exists entirely within this adaptive framework. Infrastructure, agriculture, and resource systems are all built on the assumption of stable environmental cycles. But stability in practice is always relative to recent history. So, as environmental baselines shift gradually, human systems adjust without recognizing the underlying continuity of change. Crop cycles are modified slightly. Water management adapts to subtle changes in availability timing. Energy systems respond to shifts in seasonal demand patterns. None of these adjustments are interpreted as signs of a global transition. They are seen as local optimization. And because every change is local, the global pattern remains invisible. This is how large-scale systems maintain coherence, even while evolving. They do not require awareness of transformation. They only require consistency within the current state. And once consistency is established, even a fundamentally altered system can appear completely normal from within. At this point, the original interruption no longer exists as a reference point in any active system. It is not actively remembered. It is not actively forgotten. It is simply no longer required to explain anything that is currently observed, which means, in functional terms, it has disappeared, not because it was undone, but because the system no longer depends on distinguishing it from what came after, and what came after has now become the only version of reality that remains operational.
From this point onward, the system does something subtle but final in its nature. It stops distinguishing between adaptation and baseline. Because once every layer of a system has adjusted enough times, the idea of original state loses functional meaning. What remains is only continuity that no longer references its origin. The atmosphere continues its circulation as before, but now every pattern of wind, pressure, and temperature exists within a structure that has fully absorbed the earlier disturbance. There is no residual instability, only a stable distribution of motion that carries no memory of correction. The oceans, having completed their slow internal rebalancing, now operate as a fully integrated heat system with no transitional phase remaining. Surface exchange, deep circulation, and global heat transport continue in uninterrupted rhythm, but the subtle timing relationships between layers are now permanently set within their updated configuration. Nothing is moving toward a previous state. Everything is simply continuing within the current one. On land, geological and surface processes proceed under conditions that no longer require comparison to historical baselines. Erosion, deposition, seasonal temperature cycles all function as expressions of a system that has already settled into long-term equilibrium. Even the concept of change becomes less relevant at this scale, because change implies contrast with something that is no longer actively referenced. Life, which adapts through continuity rather than reflection, now exists entirely within this stabilized structure. Biological systems no longer respond to an earlier version of the environment. They respond only to the environment as it exists now. And because that environment has been consistent for long enough, adaptation itself becomes indistinguishable from normal functioning. Human civilization reflects this same principle at a higher level of abstraction. Everything from agriculture to infrastructure to global coordination systems operates as if the current environmental conditions are not an adaptation, but the default state of reality.
There is no internal requirement to reference what came before, because nothing in daily function depends on that reference anymore. Over longer spans of time, even memory of deviation becomes irrelevant to system stability. Not erased, not preserved, simply unused. And what is unused in a continuous system gradually loses structural importance. This is the final characteristic of long-term equilibrium. Not that it resists change, but that it absorbs change so completely that change no longer exists as a separate concept within it. At this stage, the original interruption, the brief absence that initiated this entire cascade, is no longer identifiable within any active process. No system tracks it, no process depends on it, no behavior reflects it. It does not function as cause, it does not function as memory, it does not function as reference. It exists only as an abstract possibility in theoretical reconstruction of past states. And even there, it carries no influence over what the system has become, because the system has already completed its reorganization. And once a system is fully reorganized, it no longer moves back toward its origin. It only continues forward within the structure that has already been established. So what remains is not a world recovering from interruption. It is a world that has already fully integrated it into permanence. And permanence in this context is not something that was achieved. It is something that emerged naturally once nothing in the system needed to remember anything different anymore.
At this stage, the most important transformation is no longer physical. It is structural in a deeper sense. Because when every system has fully integrated a change, the difference between changed and unchanged stops being meaningful. Everything behaves as if it has always been in its current configuration. Not because history was erased, but because history is no longer required for function. The atmosphere continues to circulate energy across the planet in stable, repeating patterns. But those patterns are now the result of a long chain of adjustments that no longer need to be individually traced. Wind, pressure, and temperature relationships operate as a single continuous system that no longer separates cause from adaptation. It simply maintains flow. The oceans, which once reflected the slowest layer of adjustment, now function as the most stable component of the planetary system. Heat is stored, transported, and released in cycles that appear familiar, but are actually the outcome of a fully completed reconfiguration. There is no longer a transitional phase between states, only states that exist as long-term equilibrium expressions. On land, environmental systems follow the same principle. Seasonal variation still exists, but it is expressed within a framework that has been fully normalized. What once would have been described as shift or drift is now simply variation within acceptable bounds. And acceptable bounds themselves are defined by the current system, not by its past. Life continues within this structure without interruption. Biological systems do not require knowledge of original conditions. They require only consistency between input and response. So, when the environment stabilizes into a new long-term pattern, life does not interpret this as change. It interprets it as continuity. Species distributions, behavioral cycles, and ecological interactions all settle into patterns that reflect this continuity. Not because they have reached a final form, but because they are operating within a system that no longer presents instability as a signal requiring adaptation. Human civilization exists entirely inside this same framework. Infrastructure is no longer built in response to environmental change. It is built in alignment with environmental consistency. Agricultural systems no longer track historical variability as a primary reference. They track current equilibrium conditions as the baseline for all planning. And because every layer of human system operates under the assumption of stability, the deeper transformation of the planet becomes functionally invisible. Not because it is hidden, but because it no longer produces signals that require interpretation. Over extremely long timescales, this creates a unique condition, a system that has fully absorbed its own history to the point where that history no longer influences present behavior. The original disturbance that began this entire cascade is no longer present in any operational form, not as a memory, not as a deviation, not as a reference point. It exists only as a theoretical reconstruction that has no impact on the current state of the system. And the current state is sufficient for everything that continues to exist within it. This is what long-term equilibrium ultimately becomes, not a return to an original balance, but the complete establishment of a new one that no longer requires comparison. And within that equilibrium, the system continues indefinitely, not because it is unchanged, but because it no longer needs to recognize change in order to remain stable.
At this level of stability, the system no longer produces meaningful distinctions between phases of existence. Everything that happens is already accounted for by the structure itself. There is no external reference point the system is trying to return to. There is only internal consistency maintaining itself through continuous interaction. The atmosphere, oceans, land, and biosphere now function as a single integrated equilibrium field. Each component still behaves according to its own physical laws, but those laws no longer appear as separate influences. They operate as expressions of one unified balance. Air movement, heat transfer, and moisture cycles continue, but they are no longer interpreted as responses to change. They are simply the ongoing expression of a stable configuration. The oceans no longer carry traces of adjustment as separate events. Their circulation patterns have settled into long-term flow structures that define the planet's energy distribution without deviation from internal equilibrium. Variability still exists, but it is constrained within a predictable range that is no longer measured against historical conditions. It is only measured against itself. On land, geological and climatic processes continue at their natural pace, but even slow transformation is no longer perceived as transformation. Erosion, sedimentation, and seasonal variation are simply expressions of time passing through a stable system. Nothing within the system requires correction because nothing is considered misaligned. Life exists fully inside this condition without any awareness of the earlier transition that led here. Biological adaptation has already completed its integration phase. Organisms are not responding to a changing world. They are functioning within a world that has already settled into its long-term configuration. Behavior, instinct, and survival patterns all reflect this internalized stability. Human civilization, which once depended on recognizing patterns of environmental change, now operates entirely within established parameters. Systems of agriculture, infrastructure, and energy distribution are no longer designed around adaptation to shifting baselines. They are designed around maintaining efficiency within a known equilibrium field. And because this equilibrium has persisted long enough, it no longer appears as something that was formed. It appears as something that simply is. The deeper implication of this state is that even the concept of transformation loses practical meaning, because transformation requires comparison between two states. But when only one state is continuously experienced, comparison becomes impossible. And what cannot be compared cannot be recognized as change. At this point, the original event, the brief absence of gravity that initiated this entire cascade of adjustment, no longer exists in any functional layer of reality. Not in physics, not in biology, not in cognition, not in civilization. It has been fully absorbed into the structure that continues forward. And what continues forward no longer contains any internal mechanism for distinguishing itself from what came before. It only maintains continuity. A continuity so complete that it no longer produces the idea of interruption. And in that absence of interruption, the system no longer moves toward any resolution, because it has already resolved into itself. What remains is not the aftermath of an event. It is a stable existence that no longer carries any trace of needing to become anything else. And within that existence, everything simply continues, without reference, without contrast, without the need to remember that anything was ever different.
At this stage of complete equilibrium, the most subtle transformation is no longer occurring in the physical systems themselves, but in how those systems are experienced through perception. Because once a world becomes stable enough for long enough, perception stops registering it as something that is being observed. It becomes the background of awareness itself. Time, which was once experienced as a sequence of changes, begins to lose its sharp segmentation. Days still pass, nights still follow, but the internal sense of distinction between one moment and the next becomes softer, less defined, more continuous. Not because time has changed, but because nothing within it demands attention anymore. Human perception, which evolved to detect change, depends on contrast. It needs difference to construct meaning. But in a system that no longer produces meaningful discontinuities, perception begins to compress experience into a smoother flow. Events still occur, but they are no longer separated by strong perceptual boundaries. Everything feels slightly more continuous than before, not in a noticeable way, but in a way that gradually redefines what normal feels like. Memory also begins to reflect this shift, not by losing information, but by reorganizing its structure of importance. Moments that were once distinct begin to feel less individually defined when recalled, not blurred, but integrated into broader patterns of experience. A season is no longer remembered as a sequence of days. It is remembered as a single extended condition rather than a collection of isolated events. This is not forgetting, it is compression. And compression is how stable systems reduce cognitive load when variability is low. The environment itself continues to function with perfect consistency, but perception is not designed to measure consistency. It is designed to measure change. So when change becomes minimal or distributed too evenly across time, perception adapts by smoothing it into continuity.
This creates a subtle shift in the sense of presence. Moments feel less sharply defined. Attention becomes less fragmented by sudden environmental demands. There is more uninterrupted awareness, but less differentiation within that awareness. In such a state, the world feels quieter not because sound has diminished, but because internal contrast has reduced. Even thought itself begins to reflect this continuity. Instead of discrete shifts from idea to idea, cognition flows more smoothly between states of understanding. One thought leads into another without sharp transitions. Not slower, just more continuous. This is the psychological reflection of a physically stable world. And it is important to understand that nothing external is causing this directly. It is not imposed, it is emergent, a result of long-term exposure to a system that no longer produces strong variation. Outside the mind, civilization continues to function with full complexity, but internally, the experience of that complexity becomes less segmented. Systems operate, processes continue, structures evolve slowly, but none of these require sudden attention anymore, because nothing is breaking from expectation. This is what long-term stability does at the level of perception. It does not remove reality, it reduces the need to constantly interpret it. And as interpretation becomes less frequently required, awareness itself becomes more uniform. Not empty, not dull, just continuous. At this point in the system's evolution, even the idea of before and after begins to lose its practical role in thought. Because when nothing interrupts flow, memory stops organizing itself around interruption. It organizes around persistence, and persistence has no obvious edges. Which means the world is no longer experienced as a sequence of changes occurring within stability. It is experienced as stability expressing itself through continuous existence. And within that experience, everything feels as though it has always been this way. Not because it was, but because nothing in the present moment contradicts it anymore.
As perception continues to adapt to long-term stability, something even subtler begins to shift. Not in the environment, not in the systems, but in the relationship between awareness and time itself. Time is still measured externally. Clocks still move. Celestial cycles still continue with precision. But internally, the experience of time begins to lose its rigid segmentation. Not in a way that breaks function, but in a way that smooths transitions between moments. The mind no longer experiences time as a chain of distinct points. It experiences it as a continuous field. Events still exist, but their separation becomes less emphasized in perception. This is not distortion, it is adaptation to low-contrast reality. In environments where change is rare or gradual, cognition naturally reduces the energy spent on constantly reevaluating state differences. So attention becomes less reactive, more sustained, less interrupted by the need to reorient, and more capable of remaining within uninterrupted observation. This creates a quiet shift in how reality feels from within, not because reality has changed, but because the processing of reality has become more efficient. In this state, even emotional responses begin to reflect continuity.
Instead of sharp rises and falls tied to sudden external changes, emotional states begin to stabilize into longer durations. Not static, but less fragmented, more like slowly evolving backgrounds than rapid reactions. This does not reduce depth of experience, it reduces volatility of interpretation. Meanwhile, the external world continues its quiet equilibrium without deviation. Atmospheric systems still move energy across the planet in predictable patterns. Ocean currents still transport heat through deep and surface layers. Seasonal cycles still occur with full structural integrity. But none of these processes now require interpretation as events. They are simply ongoing conditions. And when everything becomes ongoing, nothing stands out as interruption. Civilization operating within this continuity begins to reflect the same principle, not through visible transformation, but through long-term normalization of stability. Systems are no longer designed around adaptation to change. They are designed around maintaining coherence within a stable range of conditions. This reduces the need for reactive restructuring and increases the importance of long-term consistency. As a result, planning, infrastructure, and resource management all begin to assume that the current state is not temporary, it is the default. This assumption becomes so deeply embedded that it no longer appears as an assumption at all. It appears as reality itself. And once reality is experienced as something stable and non-negotiable, its historical formation becomes irrelevant to daily function. The origin of the system fades from operational awareness, not because it is unknown, but because it is no longer needed. At this point, even the idea that something once disrupted the system becomes functionally unnecessary, because nothing in present experience requires that reference. And what is not required gradually disappears from active cognition. Not erased, just unused. And in systems like this, unused structures lose relevance until they no longer influence anything that continues to operate. So what remains is not a world that remembers its transformation. It is a world that no longer has a mechanism for distinguishing transformation from continuity. Everything persists, without contrast, without interruption, without reference to anything outside the current flow of existence.
At this stage, the system reaches a very specific kind of stability. Not the stability of stillness, but the stability of uninterrupted continuation. Everything that once required adjustment has already been adjusted so many times that adjustment itself is no longer an identifiable process. It has become part of the baseline behavior of the system. The atmosphere no longer responds to conditions in a way that feels like correction. It simply maintains circulation within established patterns that already account for all long-term influences. Pressure systems form, dissolve, and reform, but none of these transitions are experienced as deviation from a norm. They are the norm expressing itself through variation. Oceans operate in the same way. Heat is still absorbed near the equator and transported toward higher latitudes. Deep currents still move slowly across the planet in cycles that span far beyond human perception. But these processes no longer feel like mechanisms reacting to change. They feel like permanent structures of motion, stable pathways through which energy continuously flows. Land systems, too, have settled into a long-term rhythm.
Weathering, erosion, and sedimentation continue, but their effects are now absorbed into a broader equilibrium that no longer distinguishes between short-term variation and long-term transformation. Everything becomes part of a single ongoing process of maintenance rather than change. Life exists entirely within this structure, without reference to any earlier version of it. Biological systems operate through adaptation, but adaptation itself depends on detecting difference. When difference becomes minimal or distributed evenly across time, adaptation loses its urgency. It does not disappear, it stabilizes. Behavior, instinct, and survival mechanisms continue to function, but they operate within a range that no longer produces strong corrective responses. Instead of reacting to change, life begins to refine efficiency within consistency. Human civilization reflects this same transition at scale. Infrastructure no longer evolves in response to instability. It evolves through optimization within stability. Agriculture, energy distribution, communication networks, and settlement patterns all assume long-term continuity of environmental conditions. This assumption is not questioned because it is constantly reinforced by experience, and experience, over time, replaces memory as the primary reference for reality. What is experienced consistently becomes what is considered natural, and what is considered natural no longer requires explanation. In this environment, even the concept of transformation becomes abstract. It exists in theory, but not in perception, because perception relies on contrast, and contrast has been gradually reduced by long-term equilibrium. So the world is no longer experienced as something that changed and then stabilized. It is experienced as something that simply is, without reference to origin, without reference to deviation, without reference to anything outside its current continuity. At this level of integration, even the idea of a prior state becomes functionally irrelevant, not because it is inaccessible, but because it no longer interacts with anything in the present system. And in systems governed entirely by interaction, what does not interact effectively ceases to exist in practical terms. What remains is a continuous field of stable processes, all aligned within a single coherent structure of existence. Not because they have stopped evolving, but because evolution itself has become indistinguishable from stability.
At this point, the distinction between system behavior and system identity begins to dissolve completely. What a system does and what a system is become the same thing. Because when change becomes fully integrated into continuity, there is no longer a separate category for transformation. Everything is simply ongoing structure. The atmosphere continues its circulation without interruption, but it no longer expresses patterns that can be meaningfully separated into before adjustment and after adjustment. Those distinctions have already been absorbed into the long-term equilibrium of motion. Wind, pressure, and thermal gradients still exist, but they now form a continuous, self-consistent system that does not require external comparison to maintain coherence. The oceans continue their role as the planet's slowest energy regulator, but even this description begins to lose its sense of temporality, because regulation implies correction, and correction implies deviation. In a fully stabilized system, deviation is no longer a meaningful concept. What remains is only distribution,
a continuous redistribution of energy that never departs from equilibrium enough to require recognition as imbalance. Land systems follow the same pattern. Geological and surface-level processes continue with full physical accuracy, but their long-term outcomes no longer represent movement toward a different state. They represent internal consistency maintained across time. Even erosion, which once implied gradual change, becomes simply part of a stable cycle of renewal and redistribution. Life, operating within this fully integrated structure, no longer encounters environmental conditions as variables requiring adaptation. Instead, conditions are experienced as constants within which variation occurs. This reverses the perception of change. Instead of life adapting to environment, environment and life are perceived as co-stable expressions of the same system. Human civilization reflects this integration most clearly in its long-term organization. Infrastructure, agriculture, and resource systems are no longer designed around anticipating instability. They are designed around sustaining coherence within an environment that is assumed to remain consistent. And because this assumption is continuously validated by experience, it no longer appears as an assumption, it appears as reality itself. Over long periods of time, this produces a subtle but complete shift in how existence is interpreted. The world is no longer understood as something that underwent transformation and then settled. It is understood as something that has always existed in its current form, not because memory is erased, but because memory no longer plays an active role in defining present structure. The original disturbance, the brief absence of gravity that once initiated this entire cascade of adjustments, no longer exists in any functional layer of the system, not as cause, not as reference, not as deviation. It exists only as an abstract reconstruction that has no influence on current behavior. And because it has no influence, it has no operational existence within the system. What remains is a fully continuous state of equilibrium, a state in which every process persists without interruption, and every interaction reinforces the stability of the whole. Not because nothing has changed, but because all change has already been absorbed so completely that it no longer stands apart from continuity itself.
At this stage, even the concept of change no longer operates as an active idea within the system. Not because change has stopped happening, but because nothing within the system can isolate it as a separate category anymore. Everything that occurs is already part of continuous equilibrium. There is no longer a reference point that defines what different would mean, because difference requires comparison, and comparison requires memory of an alternative state that is no longer functionally accessible. So what remains is only continuity without contrast. The atmosphere continues to circulate energy across the planet in perfectly stable patterns of variation. But those variations are no longer interpreted as deviations. They are simply expressions of a system maintaining internal balance. The oceans continue their slow global movement of heat and momentum, but there is no longer a conceptual boundary between stability and adjustment. Everything is part of the same ongoing process. On land, long-term geological and climatic cycles continue without interruption, but their significance as indicators of change has dissolved. Erosion, deposition, and seasonal shifts are no longer interpreted as signs of transformation. They are simply the rhythm of a stable system expressing itself over time. Life, operating entirely within this structure, no longer responds to environmental variation as a trigger for adaptation. Instead, all variation is absorbed into an already normalized range of existence. Behavior continues, but without the interpretive weight of change behind it. It becomes purely functional continuity. Civilization, at this stage, no longer organizes itself around expectations of environmental shift. Instead, it operates entirely within a framework where all known conditions are assumed to be persistent. Infrastructure is designed not for adaptation, but for long-term coherence. Agriculture, energy, and resource systems function within a stable envelope of environmental behavior that no longer requires correction or anticipation, because nothing in lived experience presents itself as fundamentally new. Even time, which once provided a framework for distinguishing past from present, becomes less segmented in perception. It still passes, but it no longer feels like a sequence of distinct states. It feels like a continuous field of ongoing existence. At this point, the original event, the brief interruption in gravity that initiated the entire cascade of systemic adjustment, is no longer present in any layer of reality. It does not influence physical systems. It does not influence biological systems. It does not influence cognitive systems. It does not influence civilization. It exists only as a theoretical construct that has no functional role in describing what the system is doing now. And because it has no functional role, it does not participate in reality as it is currently experienced. What remains is a fully stabilized equilibrium state, a state in which every system continues to operate, but none of them require reference to anything outside their present condition in order to remain consistent. And within this condition, existence is no longer perceived as something that is changing. It is perceived as something that simply continues, without interruption, without contrast, without the need for anything else to define it. At this final layer of continuity, the system no longer produces anything that can be interpreted as transition. Not because transition has been removed, but because it has been fully absorbed into the structure of permanence. Everything continues to function exactly as before. Atmospheric circulation still redistributes heat and moisture across the planet in endlessly repeating but slightly varied patterns. Ocean systems still transport energy across vast scales of depth and time, maintaining global thermal balance without interruption. Land systems still evolve through slow geological and climatic processes that remain fully active, even if no longer perceived as meaningful change. Life continues in its biological rhythms, fully synchronized with the environment it inhabits. And human civilization continues to operate through systems that assume long-term stability as the fundamental condition of existence. Nothing has stopped. Nothing has collapsed. Nothing has deviated outside the bounds of coherence. And yet, something essential has shifted in how all of this is understood internally. Because understanding itself no longer requires separation between states. The system is no longer experienced as something that became stable. It is experienced as something that simply is stable, with no remembered divergence from that condition, no active contrast between past and present, no internal need to reconstruct a different version of reality in order to define the current one.
Even memory, which once functioned as a bridge between states of change, no longer plays that structural role. It still exists, but it no longer organizes perception around difference. It organizes perception around continuity. And continuity does not point backward. It only extends forward without interruption. At this point, the original interruption in gravity is no longer part of any functional description of the world. Not because it was undone, not because it was erased, but because it no longer has any structural relationship with the system that exists now. It cannot modify behavior. It cannot influence interpretation. It cannot reappear as a meaningful reference point. It is outside the operational boundary of reality as it is currently maintained. What remains is a fully integrated equilibrium field in which every process, every system, and every interaction exists in stable coherence with all others, not held together by force, not maintained by correction, but continuing naturally, because no part of the system requires a different state in order to function. And in that condition, there is no longer a distinction between what changed and what remained the same. There is only what continues, without origin, without interruption, without end.
And now, there is nothing left to follow in the form of explanation, because everything that needed to be observed has already unfolded. What remains is not a continuation of ideas, but the continuation of presence itself. The system no longer requires interpretation. It simply continues, silently, stably, without reference to what it once was, and without needing to become anything else. If you are still here, there is nothing more to understand. Only the quiet realization that even change, when fully absorbed, becomes indistinguishable from stillness. So now, we let the system remain as it is, and we let the mind follow it into silence. From this point onward, the narration will fade, and what remains is only sound, brown noise, and the distant texture of space itself. No more structure, no more direction, only a steady field for rest, for sleep, for letting go. Good night, and let everything continue without you needing to hold it in place anymore.